Have you ever wondered what it feels like to witness the impossible becoming possible right before your eyes? What would you do if you had just escaped the most powerful empire on earth through a miracle so extraordinary that water itself bent to divine will? Picture this. You're standing on the opposite shore, watching the army that enslaved your people for 4 centuries disappear beneath the crashing waves of the Red Sea. Your heart is pounding, your breath is shallow, and suddenly, in that moment of overwhelming victory, something erupts from deep within your soul. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but a song so powerful it would echo through history for over 3,000 years. This is exactly what happened to Moses and the children of Israel in one of the most pivotal moments recorded in human history. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. The song that followed wasn't just a celebration. It was a prophetic declaration that would shape the very identity of a nation. And what came after that song? A journey into the wilderness that would test everything they thought they knew about faith, survival, and the character of God Himself. Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover in Exodus chapters 15 through 17 will challenge everything you think you know about leadership under pressure, divine provision in impossible circumstances, and why sometimes God leads us through the wilderness instead of around it. Drop a 777 in the comments if you're ready to discover the shocking truths hidden in this ancient story that still speak directly to our modern struggles. The moment the last Egyptian chariot vanished beneath the Red Sea, something extraordinary happened. The silence that followed the thunderous crash of water was broken not by weeping or whispers, but by the most spontaneous and powerful worship service in recorded history. Moses, the man who had stammered before Pharaoh, who had doubted his own calling, who had pleaded with God to send someone else, suddenly became the conductor of a divine symphony. But this wasn't planned. This wasn't rehearsed. The song of Moses erupted from the depths of human experience when the impossible collided with reality. Think about it. These people had been slaves for 400 years. 4 centuries of back-breaking labor, of watching their children murdered, of crying out to a God who seemed silent. And now, in a single moment, everything had changed. The most powerful military force on earth lay buried beneath the sea, and they were free. The song begins with words that still send chills down the spine. I will sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider He has thrown into the sea. But notice something crucial here. Moses doesn't start with "we will sing." He starts with "I will sing." This wasn't corporate worship beginning with a committee decision. This was one man's heart overflowing with such gratitude and awe that it became contagious. What makes this song even more remarkable is its content. This wasn't just a victory chant. Moses was declaring theological truths about the character of God that would become foundational to everything that followed. He proclaimed God as a warrior, as their strength, as their salvation, as the one who would reign forever and ever. These weren't just poetic expressions born from emotion. They were prophetic declarations that would shape Israel's understanding of who they served for generations to come. And then something beautiful happened. Miriam, Moses' sister, stepped forward with a tambourine in her hand. The same woman who had watched over baby Moses in the bulrushes, who had boldly approached Pharaoh's daughter, now led all the women of Israel in dance and song. Can you imagine that scene? Hundreds, perhaps thousands of women dancing and singing by the shore of the Red Sea, their voices joining in the refrain that would never be forgotten. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. This wasn't just a moment of celebration, it was a moment of transformation. These were no longer slaves. They were a people who had witnessed the power of their God, and their song declared it to the heavens and to every generation that would follow. The Song of Moses became the first recorded hymn in Scripture, and it established a pattern that would echo throughout biblical history. When God moves in power, his people respond in worship. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. The celebration was over. The song had been sung. The tambourines were put away. And now Moses had to lead these newly freed people into one of the most hostile environments on earth, the wilderness of Shur. What happened next would test everything they had just declared about their God in that powerful song. For 3 days they walked, 3 days without finding water. Think about that timeline. 3 days earlier they had been singing about God's mighty power. 3 days earlier they had declared him their strength and their salvation. And now, after just 72 hours in the wilderness, they were facing a crisis that would reveal the true condition of their hearts. The human body can survive only about 3 days without water in desert conditions. They weren't just getting thirsty. They were approaching the edge of survival. And when they finally found water at a place called Mara, it was bitter, undrinkable. Cruel irony seemed to mock their recent celebration. The God who had just parted the Red Sea had led them to water they couldn't drink. This is where we see something profound about the nature of faith and the character of God. The people did what people do when faced with impossible circumstances. They complained. They grumbled against Moses. They questioned the wisdom of leaving Egypt. But Moses did something different. Instead of arguing with the people or defending his leadership, he cried out to the Lord, and God's response was both immediate and instructive. He showed Moses a tree, and when Moses threw it into the bitter waters, they became sweet. But this wasn't just about solving a water crisis. This was about establishing a pattern of divine provision that would sustain them through 40 years in the wilderness. God wasn't just meeting their immediate need. He was teaching them something fundamental about his character and their relationship with him. What happened next at Marah would become one of the most significant covenant moments in Israel's history. God made them a promise that would echo through every subsequent trial they would face. God declared himself to be Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. He promised that if they would listen carefully to his voice, obey his commands, and keep his statutes, he would not bring upon them any of the diseases he had brought upon the Egyptians. This wasn't just a medical promise. This was a spiritual covenant wrapped in the language of healing. God was saying that their obedience would be the antidote to the spiritual sickness that had plagued Egypt. But notice the deeper pattern emerging here. God had led them to bitter water on purpose. He could have led them directly to sweet water, but he chose to let them taste bitterness first. Why? because sometimes God allows us to encounter the bitter before He reveals the sweet. Sometimes the miracle isn't in avoiding the problem, but in watching God transform it right before our eyes. From Mara, they traveled to Elim, and what a contrast this was. 12 springs of fresh water and 70 palm trees. After the bitterness of Mara, Elim must have felt like paradise. But here's what's fascinating. They didn't stay at Elim. God didn't lead them to the oasis so they could settle down and build vacation homes. Elim was a rest stop, a place of refreshment before the next phase of their journey. And that next phase would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. They entered the wilderness of sin, and the very name should have been a warning. This wasn't just another desert. This was a place that would expose the condition of their hearts in the most uncomfortable way possible. A month and a half had passed since they left Egypt. The euphoria of freedom was wearing off, and the harsh reality of wilderness living was setting in. And then the food ran out. Can you picture the scene? Thousands of people, families with children, elderly grandparents who had lived through decades of slavery, all looking to Moses with hunger in their eyes and fear in their hearts. The same people who had sung so powerfully about God's provision were now grumbling. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Here's the shocking truth about human nature. We have incredibly short memories when it comes to God's faithfulness. 6 weeks earlier, these people had watched the Red Sea part. They had seen the Egyptian army destroyed. They had sung songs about God's mighty power. And now they were romanticizing their slavery, remembering the food but forgetting the whips, remembering the meals but forgetting the misery. But God's response reveals something beautiful about His character. He didn't rebuke them for their complaining. Instead, He said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." Notice that phrase, "I will rain down bread from heaven." Not, "I might provide," or "I'll see what I can do." God spoke with absolute certainty about a miracle that had never happened before in human history. And then came the evening quail. Exhausted birds migrating in massive flocks settled over the camp so densely that the people could gather them with simple hand nets. But this wasn't just a fortunate coincidence. This was divine orchestration. God was providing meat when they had complained about having none. But the real miracle came in the morning. When the dew lifted, there on the ground was something thin and flaky, fine as frost. The people looked at it and asked, "What is it?" In Hebrew they said manhu, lezudif, which became the name for this supernatural food, manna. For the next 40 years, 6 days a week, this bread from heaven would appear with the morning dew. No farming required, no storage necessary, just daily dependence on divine provision. But here's where the story gets really interesting. God attached specific instructions to this miracle. They were to gather only what they needed for each day. No hoarding allowed, no saving up for tomorrow. Those who tried to keep extra overnight discovered it crawling with worms and stinking with decay. The only exception was the 6th day, when they could gather enough for the Sabbath, and it would remain fresh. Why such strict rules about miraculous food? Because God wasn't just feeding their bodies, He was training their hearts. He was teaching them to live with daily dependence rather than self-sufficient stockpiling. He was showing them that His provision comes not through their planning, but through their trusting. This wasn't just about calories, this was about character formation. Some of the people failed the test miserably. They tried to hoard when God said, "Don't hoard." They tried to gather on the Sabbath when God said, "Rest." And Moses was frankly angry with them. Here was divine provision literally falling from the sky, and some people still couldn't follow simple instructions. But the deeper question haunts every reader of this story. Why do people who have witnessed spectacular displays of God's power slip so easily into complaining and disobedience? How do you go from singing victory songs to grumbling about food in just 6 weeks? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human nature and something beautiful about divine patience. The journey continued, and their next stop would bring a crisis that would test not just their faith, but their very survival in ways they had never imagined. The journey from the Red Sea to Rephidim reveals a pattern that echoes through every generation. The same God who parts seas also leads through wildernesses. The same voice that commands waters to stand like walls also whispers instructions about daily bread. What we've witnessed in these 3 chapters isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting our own souls back to us. Moses and the Israelites discovered something that every follower of God must learn. Victory songs and wilderness testing aren't opposites. They're partners in the divine curriculum of faith. The God who gave them reason to sing also gave them reason to trust when the singing stopped and the real work began. Their story teaches us that complaining comes naturally. But worship must be cultivated. That provision often comes disguised as problems we need God to solve. That sometimes the bitter waters of Mara are exactly what we need to appreciate the sweet springs of Elim. And that manna falling from heaven isn't just about feeding hungry bodies. It's about training stubborn hearts to depend on divine timing rather than human planning. The wilderness wasn't their punishment. It was their preparation. And maybe, just maybe, whatever wilderness you're walking through right now isn't God's rejection of your song. It's His invitation to sing a deeper one, a song that declares His faithfulness not just when the waters part, but when they're bitter. Not just when enemies are defeated, but when provisions are delayed. Not just in moments of triumph, but in seasons of testing. That's the song that echoes through eternity.